but this particular atlas, there are 3 full pages having to do with Texas and Texas cities. And at the top right, there's an inset map just showing different sections of the state of Texas. And the section that I grew up in is this one, and it's called the Panhandle of Texas. And to give you a sense of the size, this Panhandle area is roughly 3/4 the area of the state of Iowa. One quick story, this part of the state of Texas is amazingly flat as the pool tabletop. Very little vegetation, some mesquite trees, lots of blowing wind, lots of sand. My mother, Tornado Alley, part of it, yes. And my mother grew up in that area, and she was inclined to say that was God's country. My response to that had always been that either God had a sense of humor or no sense of taste. In any case, and the setting, I'm going to tell about my very early years. And as it happens, my father was a minister in the Methodist Church, so we moved around. And so part of what I'm going to tell you has to do with, well, I was born up here in Amarillo, but then my parents, we lived for a couple of years way down here in a small town called Sundown. My very early years. When I was very young, younger than I can now remember, my experiences in life were apparently the result of a combination of factors. Plans made for me by adults, circumstances beyond anybody's control, the love of my 3 parents, God's providential care, and good luck. From the time before I was born, I was influenced by the health and the health-related decisions of my biological mother, whose name was Ruby. Why do I say this? I say it because of vitally important personal information that my father gave me about my mother and my birth. And parenthetically, I say, in fact, he gave me this information several times over the years because he wanted to make sure I would remember it. What was this information? Dad told me several times that my biological mother was not in good health during the first year of their marriage, a year they lived in the small town of Sundown, Texas, where my father was the pastor of the Methodist Church. Her physician cautioned her not to become pregnant, but she wanted deeply to have a child with my dad. So, against medical advice, she became pregnant, survived a very difficult pregnancy, and gave birth to me on January 15, 43, in St. Anthony's Hospital in Amarillo, Texas. I was given the name of my maternal grandfather, who lived in a small town south of Amarillo. Not only had the pregnancy been difficult for medical reasons, and parenthetically, she suffered from what was called sprue in those days, now called celiac disease, and other complications. But it had also been difficult, that pregnancy had also been difficult because much of the world was engaged in World War II. My father, like millions of other American men and women, had felt a patriotic duty to enlist in the military, and thus he had volunteered to join the Army as a chaplain. I cannot imagine how difficult this decision must have been for both of my parents. That joint decision meant that during much of my biological mother's pregnancy and for much of the first year of my life, my father was not present. Rather, he was in boot camp, chaplain school at Harvard, and later in San Francisco, waiting with thousands of other soldiers to be sent into battle somewhere in the Pacific. He returned to Texas whenever he could get a leave, including several emergency leaves, but apparently that did not happen very often. Since he was usually gone and my biological mother was unable physically to provide the care I needed, I lived most of my first year with one of my aunts, one of Ruby's sisters, and her family, and they lived either in Canyon, where the girls had grown up, or in Borger, where this family later lived. I simply don't know which city it was. My biological mother died in October 1943, so 9 months later. After her death, my aunt, who had taken care of me during the first year, after her death, my aunt tried to persuade my father to let her adopt me, since he was still in the Army. Though by that time he was stationed at the Amarillo Air Force Base, never having been sent to the Pacific. He did not agree with her, and they apparently had a major argument about me and my future. My father took me from her home and drove me to the family farm outside Childress, Texas. There, in that crisis situation, he turned me over to his older sister, my auntie, and her family, including a son who was a year older than I was. I lived with them on the farm for 6 to 8 months. They would become, over the years, without doubt, my favorite relatives. And my life would later be enriched with several wonderful visits to visit them and play on the Johnson farm. By the way, parenthetic, as best as I remember the story, apparently my dad more or less kind of drove up to the farm with me and said, will you, can you? Not long after being transferred to Amarillo, my father, by then a captain in the Army, met Earlene Wilson, who at that time was a secretary in the First Baptist Church in Amarillo, whose first husband had died from a very unusual baseball accident. She and my father met on a blind date, a date arranged by Al and Evangeline Meyer. He was a Lutheran chaplain at the Air Force Base. She was a musician friend of Earlene Wilson, and their friendship and joint love of music would last until my mother's death. When I was 5, Dad was appointed to be the pastor of the Methodist Church in Roscoe, another small Texas town, some 50 to 60 miles from Abilene. As was the tradition in the Methodist denomination, ministerial families who were moving to another city and church made those often difficult moves in the month of June, which more than once in my childhood meant that I would experience another lonely first summer in the new town, not yet having made friends at school. But our first evening in the parsonage in Roscoe signaled that I and we had moved to a home, a town, and a church that would turn out to be the highlight of my young childhood. I remember my first Roscoe experience vividly. It was dark when we first entered the house. We were tired after a long day on the road. Most of our furniture had not yet been delivered. And Mother was voicing concern that the next morning she might discover that the previous family had left us a dirty house. We went to the kitchen, turned on the light, opened the refrigerator door, and to our utter surprise and joy, found the refrigerator completely filled. With all kinds of food that had been purchased and made by the members of our new church. What a great way to be introduced to Roscoe, which would become my favorite hometown. Why? For the first time in my life, I had friends in the neighborhood. Not just one, but several. All boys roughly the same age as mine. I remember playing lots of games of catch with them. They also had baseball gloves. I remember turning the chicken coop with their help. We turned it into a neighborhood, quote, boys club building. I remember finding a broken part of the wooden fence that became a secret passageway just for me and my friends. I remember running and having fun in the yard with a new dog that my dad named Bounce, because this dog could jump almost vertically, seemingly to impossible heights. Not quite enough to jump over the fence, but as I remember, several times his own height. And I remember spending many, many hours during the summer inside the unusual collection of branches of the chinaberry tree. Inside that tree, but staying on the ground, I greatly enjoyed my shady private world with some early reading books, Bounce, and undoubtedly my baseball and glove nearby. To this day, I remember that backyard as almost an ideal place for a young boy and his dog to spend time together. In addition, I realize now that those years in Roscoe provided me with a number of experiences that contained lessons that have been with me for decades. Not exactly like Robert Fulgham's "All I Really Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten," but perhaps similar. I'll pick 10 lessons I learned in Roscoe and then explain the experience that provided the lesson. Now, I'm not going to get into the 10. Not all 10 haven't been written yet, but let me give you just one, and then that'll do it for today. And I'll come back to this next time. One of the lessons I learned, it's wrong to steal. I don't know why I did this, but one Sunday, as the collection plate was being passed down the pew at church, I took $1 out and put it in my pocket. Later, at home, I hid the money in what seemed like a safe place, on the window ledge, behind the Venetian blinds, beside the back door. To me, from my short height perspective, the $1 seemed completely hidden from view. What I did not realize was that from the angle of vision my parents had, the $1 was immediately and easily visible. They, of course, spotted the stolen $1 soon after I had hidden it and asked me where the money had come from. I admitted, in an emotional state, that I had taken the $1 from the offering plate. My punishment, I had to walk back over to the church by myself, find the stack of offering plates, and put the $1 back in the top plate. To be continued.
Very nice. Well organized. I like the way you started out, kind of placing your story. I think that's really helpful if you're looking ahead to what your volume is going to be like. Sometimes I've always tried to have an introduction, maybe historical or maybe geographic, so that people understand where we're going. In my Navy introduction, I started out where I was emotionally when I found out Korean War started, and then I have another piece of the prelude that talks, what was the Korean War? You know, people kind of jump around, we have so many wars, so I was pretty specific about where it was, what the history was, when we went, when we finished, the cost of the war, and then got into some other pieces about my experiences, but it really is helpful. I know in some of Claire's stories, she's had some great adventures, but she's put in what the Contra War was like in Central America, because she wasn't one of the rebels, but she was one of the peacemakers down there.
Well, especially since most of us presumably are writing for a younger audience
You bet.
that
You bet.
wouldn't have known this other stuff.
Exactly. So that's a really great piece.
Thank you.
Has Robert, your connection to your mother, not biological, but obviously was very strong? I mean, like, she just couldn't have been, I'm gathering that, although you didn't say it, she couldn't have been more of a mother to you. And along with that, did you ever wonder why there weren't any siblings, or was that not?
Oh, some years into the marriage, she did become pregnant, but had a miscarriage. And surgery connected with it, so that it, at that point, became clear to them and to me later that there was not going to be a sibling.
In all of your early travels, has this left you with a sense of wanting to continue that sand under my shoes bit, or have you settled down?
We moved to, well, my wife and I have lived in 6 states, largely for job and education reasons, moving around. But we moved here in '88, and this has been the longest place we've lived. Either one of us has lived any time during our lives, and we plan to stay. We have retired here, we plan to die here. We like Iowa.
Amen. You had me from the very beginning when you made that list of things that had influenced you, and you ended up with good luck. But you had some really strong things along, and it was a combination that was varied. You know, it wasn't just kind of the routine things, and that tickled me. And I think that you did what I think probably many, maybe most people do when they're writing. They tend to start at the very beginning and do it chronologically. But you did it in such a fluid way, it just rolled along. There was no sense that you were having to follow a calendar.
Oh, well.
You know, it just moved us right along with you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Some of the sitting under the Chinaberry tree with Bounce and your baseball glove, it sounded like a good life. At the time I'm describing, I was in my later 40s. I had been divorced for 5 years, lived alone. My children were all raised. At this time, my mom was hospitalized. She was dying from bone cancer, about an hour drive away. And I went as often as I could to see her, usually twice a week. So we'll get to it. Nancy, an older woman at work who went to square dances regularly, convinced me to sign up for a series of lessons once a week for several months. Square dancing has evolved from being various combinations of only a few basic movements. Dos-a-do and allemand left and promenade are all the old standards. Nowadays, some calls are intricate, and a novice can get completely confused, scrambling the 7 other dancers in the square as well. With this complexity, your mind gets a workout as well as your feet. This dance is active, and an evening of the lessons was good exercise. I found a pretty dress, used, they are expensive when new. It had the typical yards and yards of hemline, belled out with stiff, flounced petticoats that are cute when you skip and swing through the steps, but are something funny to manage when you sit at a table or slide under the wheel to drive home. Randy's hoop skirts probably flew up in front when she sat down behind too until she learned how to cope with them. What price women pay to be dressed appropriately. One day when I went to see Mama, I wore my outfit and she made polite comments. The petticoats might have reminded her of teenage styles during the 1950s. Did she think I was reverting to my silly years, still wanting can-can slips? I didn't care if she saw it, though. Their frivolity amused me, and I was glad to give her something different to think about for a while. I hoarded innocuous topics for our visits. She was only politely interested in my work, and my acquaintances were just names to her, indistinguishable. I didn't raise a garden, or can, or try new recipes, or sew. The Weathers always got thorough coverage while we talked, and I remember one quiet late afternoon when we watched a flock of colorful hot air balloons float slowly and serenely across the city, the colors in their various designs glowing, lit by the sun low in the sky. But so many things seemed to be awkward to discuss. I let her take the lead about what serious matters we might touch on. Her illness was a sad topic, and talk about her health conditions of the day could only be stretched so far. Concerns about my own family were gloomy too, and made us both uncomfortable, a topic avoided. It did seem unfair to bring my insignificant worries to her, who daily dealt with approaching mortality, the most enormous problem a person could ever face. In those circumstances, it felt that it would not be appropriate to mention a health problem of my own. Might I have cancer too? It was a definite lump I had found on my breast, confirmed by X-ray. Certainly I was sensitized to the very word cancer, even as only a possibility. Indeed, I did not hesitate to arrange for the biopsy, although with real qualms, as any woman would understand. I knew I might wake up after the surgery, changed for life, but for life would justify the sacrifice if it were found to be necessary. By arrangement through my doctor, I spoke with several women who had been through the fearful experience of a positive biopsy and a mastectomy. This thinking my way through the possibilities and finding others who could calmly discuss what might happen was exactly the best preparation for me. Clear thinking with solid information has always improved my coping ability. My surgeon was a human being I admired, who had published down-to-earth poetry written from a medical perspective, who was highly respected for his caring contributions to the community, and who shared his contemplative insights in our study group which explored the scriptures at my church. His wife had withdrawn from the world, becoming a recluse after they lost an adult child, but he honored their marriage. Some of his poems were to her in her sorrow. Under different circumstances, no wife, I would have liked to know him more, and I wondered if I might babble something embarrassing while I was out during the surgery. Perhaps he was used to any such involuntary revelations, and the operating room isn't a romantic moonlit venue either. Being thorough and reminded again of how tenuous is life, witness Mama's cancer, I had a will drawn up and signed it. For some reason, I wanted my daughter Rainey to be aware of the will, and I had some keepsakes to pass along too. Maybe I just wanted a comforting shoulder to lean on. Maybe I didn't know myself what I had in mind. When I called to ask her to come see me, she was reluctant, but she drove the hour anyway on that December Sunday before my Monday hospital appointment. She wasn't worried about my situation. Maybe she thought I was being melodramatic when I explained about the biopsy and what it might lead to. I would hate to think I was. Theatrics have not usually been my style. Neither she nor I thought to mention her being at the hospital with me. It was only after she drove off to return to her husband and home that I thought of what I would have done if my mother or my daughter had faced such an ominous operation. Perhaps without really thinking about it that way, I had called her hoping that if she knew the need, she would offer. If that was my unconscious motivation at the time, it wasn't effective. Any such message to her was too subtle. You've always been able to take care of yourself was not comforting support from the second generation either. My former husband had told me that. During that long and tedious evening with just Kat and me in my silent apartment, it was hard to avoid worrying about what the next day would bring. I would go into surgery with no one concerned to know how I came through it and the findings. If I woke to find a mastectomy had been necessary, I would face that devastation alone. I did resent that enormously. While sitting alone, the silence encouraged me to wonder how I had managed to raise a daughter with so little empathy and precious little concern for her mother. Why? At a time of fear and stress, when I needed to draw on all available internal resources, this lack of support drained my spirit, leaving me cruelly fragile. To know that you are alone only because no one cares might well leave a permanent scar. Recognizing that I was being treated poorly was not self-pity. If my resources were insufficient for the double stress of the challenge I faced and also the abandonment, how would I survive? If I was strong and able to cope, I still might reasonably resolve not to let myself be hurt again by those who turn their backs on me at a time of need. Don't expect and you won't be disappointed. It is the antithesis of optimism. It was not a good evening. Next morning I drove myself to the hospital, resolutely living only moment by moment. I remember being so cold while the preliminary work was being done, which involved positioning several needles so their points identified the exact spot to be investigated. A nurse brought me a heated blanket, and I was grateful. The sedating medication was working, and I could not worry about the outcome. Then the table and I were rolled down the hall. So nice not to be worried. Yes, sir, it is not moonlight. but bright, bright overhead lights I see above me, and I close my eyes against their intensity. I hear my doctor's good voice, in charge and knowledgeable. I can relax because I know he will take care of me. That's some powerful tranquilizer. At last, all is ready, and it is time for the anesthetic, and I must consciously not fight it. In this case, as always for me, it takes an effort to yield control of myself willingly, but immediately I go out. Was there any question? When I came to awareness as the anesthesia wore off, the report was all good. No cancer had been found. Such wonderful news should have been exhilarating, but in my grogginess, a pleased contentment was all the celebration I could manage, and it was enough. After several hours to recover my senses fully, I walked carefully out the hospital doors and across the icy parking lot and drove myself home. It was 12 hours that might have had lasting impact on my life, and instead I went home with a bulky bandage but intact, with a clean slate and renewed recognition of how truly fortunate I am. I told it all to the cat, who wasn't much interested either. After a half hour of listening to only silence in my apartment, I grabbed the car keys and drove to the weekly square dance practice session. Although I didn't try to dance, sitting and watching the others meant I wasn't completely alone as I spiraled back down to normal after a day that, all things considered, turned out very well. I think I have a hard time describing emotions that I want other people to pick up on.
No.
Oh, I just feel
very-
such loneliness there. Oh my goodness.
No, you didn't.
But
You
that's fine.
captured me, right? Yeah, oh, it was very lovely writing.
The story in my life has got so many things that, there are things that are funny, there are things like this that are not funny. There are times when I was squabbling with my mother as a teenager. There are times when I wanted to hold her in my arms when she was dying. There are just a whole range of everything. And it stretches me to try to get it down where someone else will perceive what I am trying to communicate. And so,
Well, I think you could have been clear in this. I mean, what you were facing, and the fact that you really did feel kind of abandoned.
oh yeah.
And
I could just put myself into it as you
Oh,
read.
me too.
I thought, how
Me too.
would that have been like for me? Yeah.
And I didn't know they were going to be gentlemen. It was pretty thin on gentlemen last time, so I didn't.
But you have so many elements there. I mean, you have impending loss of your mother, you have your venturing into square dance, you have your relationship with your daughter, this horrible medical crisis. I mean, there are just so many parts of your
And
story.
the complications, I mean, you just drop little things, you know, this physician was a very special person to you.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
related to you,
You know, that really was. Of all those silly things to have to think about. I thought, am I going to say something that will embarrass me?
But
But that's kind of a story within the story too. I mean, there are a lot of stories within your story, but the poignancy of,
there's a validity to what you're talking about. It's not,
it's not fake.
it's not just, do I have a cancer, but, you know, I've got this little peripheral thing about relationships. I've got this thing with my daughter. I've got, you know, it's just,
It's humanity.
yeah.
Yes.
It's us as human beings.
There's one thing I've learned about love, like everything goes